Hello everyone, I wanted to share with you my quick little end of the summer project. I've been trying to do some hydroponics, and as you can see, it turned out so far fairly well. I tried doing it two ways. I had a 45-degree trellis that you can see right here, and a vertical trellis in the back. The vertical trellis is way better, especially for indeterminate species. These determinate ones, Roma tomatoes, they never really grew that tall to take advantage of the trellis, so they just kind of grew straight up, and then you couldn't really weave them through the trellis, so it wasn't very effective. But I think it still turned out all right. Got a lot of good tomatoes here. So here we have a close-up of the trellis system. You have the mesh trellis right here. It's set up on a couple of pressure-treated 2x4s. The mesh itself, the mesh fencing, a piece of it I found lying around in a barn, so I just cut it up and used it for this project. But on top there is more. There's a brand new one, and you can buy them at Tractor Supply, and they're pretty cheap for what they are. I think it's 4-gauge steel, which is about a quarter, so it's very durable. If you've looked into trellis systems for tomatoes, those are highly recommended as a long-term solution, because they will probably last forever. They'll probably outlive you. So the mesh screen on this trellis has about, I think, 4x6 maybe openings in it, which is very convenient for weaving the plants through. And once the plant is woven through the mesh, all of the weight becomes supported, or most of the weight really becomes supported by the trellis itself, and not the buckets and this plank right here. So through the mesh, I have a piece of 1/2-inch plastic tubing woven. That's the water feed for the irrigation system. In case anyone is curious, I'm using the Rainbird tubing and emitters. So over here, there's a bunch of tube woven through the mesh, and above every plant I have an emitter. I think they're gallon per hour, a single gallon per hour emitters, and then a little bit of 1/4-inch tubing that just takes, that connects the emitter closer to where the root system is. These buckets here, they're dollar store buckets, so very cheap. I think that's about as cheap as you can get for a fairly large too, container for growing hydroponics plants. Here at the farm, they find a lot of uses. Like when I bought these, they're $1 a piece, and you buy them in a packs of 36 online. If you have a dollar store nearby, you can probably buy them in smaller lots, but I bought a pack of 36, so there's $36, and I think it was another $10, maybe $15 for shipping. So in the end it came out to be, and plus tax, so in the end it came out a little more expensive than $1, but these buckets get used for everything. Here you can see them for holding plants. If earlier in the video you saw me come in to pick some tomatoes, and that's the same bucket. If whenever we're picking small quantities of vegetables or fruit, that's pretty much the go-to bucket, because you can have, we have several dozen of them. And, you can keep your fruits and vegetables separate because you have all of these containers. They're cheap. And if you're going somewhere and you need to bring a bunch of tools and you don't have a tool bag, you can just throw a bunch of tools in these buckets. They're not super durable, but they get the job done. They get the light duty jobs done. This plastic is maybe about 1/16 thick, even maybe a little less. But back to the hydroponics project. This bucket is screwed down to this plank with a couple of screws, and that's essentially so that when you're just setting up the system and you just have buckets on top of a plank without anything to connect it to the trellis, if a big strong gust of wind comes along, then it can knock down all of your buckets. So if you screw them down, they're not going to go anywhere. Screws, you can get them galvanized or stainless. The reason why you want galvanized or stainless is because this plank right here is, I think it's a 1x6, and it's pressure treated. So if you want it to last, then you want to use galvanized or stainless, otherwise the screws will rust. Now, to keep these buckets more or less sealed, I also have a rubber washer or a felt washer, just to act as a seal between the screw head and the bucket. And finally, in the bottom of the bucket over here, we have a hole drilled with a little grommet and a piece of 1/4-inch drip irrigation tubing that enters another hole in this 1.5-inch Schedule 40 PVC pipe. And this acts as the drain system. Now we're going to take a closer look at the 45-degree tilted trellis system. Originally, I kind of wanted to make it this way just because if you look at it, the 45-degree trellis, the frame for it is actually set up like a kind of a sawhorse almost. And essentially what that meant for me is that it was mobile, so that if I don't want to use it, there is nothing that's permanently attached in the ground like there is with the vertical trellis. So at the end of the year, if you don't want it around anymore, all you have to do is get rid of all the plants, pull off the mesh, and just pick the frame up with a tractor and move it wherever you want it, or just demolish it completely. But unlike with the posts that are dug into the ground for the vertical trellis, there's nothing attached to the ground. But what we have here is a trellis, or the frame for the trellis over there. I don't know if you can actually see it in the shot. Maybe you can see it over here. But between the two tilted frames, there is 2 pressure treated 2x4s that run across them and connect them. And then on top of that, the Tractor Supply mesh fence is resting on. The containers here are actually small waste buckets or waste bins. At the time, I didn't know that the dollar store buckets existed. So at the time, I just set it up with these waste bins, which I think are a little too small. I don't remember off the top of my head what their capacity is, but I think it's a little too small for these plants. what I've actually had happen is the roots of the plant would go down through the drain tube into the PVC pipe and start growing in there. It's not really that big of an issue. It's mostly an issue for drainage, but at the same time, you know, sometimes I've had these buckets fill up to the top with water and the plants turned out okay. So yes, that's why it's hydroponics. They're growing in water more or less. Other than the frame itself, it's set up the same way as the vertical trellis. You know, you can't see it here, but there is tubing. It's not woven, it's actually tied to the frame, but the 1/2-inch tubing is running across the back of the trellis, and then there are emitters there, and then there's tubing that just brings the water down closer to the plant. And once again, in the bottom of each container there's a hole, a grommet, and a piece of tubing that connects it to the drain pipe. Now, this trellis is ineffective for short plants because you just don't have enough height to them to really weave them through the openings in the mesh, and because of that, none of the weight is supported by the trellis. So that's why over here I actually ended up having to put a cinder block so that it supports all the weight over here. And this is fairly hard to bulge. If it moves a little, you know, you can tell just how much weight is on here. Overall, this trellis has been very troublesome for me. I kept getting clogged drains on here, so I would come back, you know, I would fill up my reservoir with nutrient solution, or I'd mix it directly in the reservoir, and I'd come back 2 days later and it'd be all gone because some of these drains would clog up and then they would overflow and I'd lose all the nutrient solution down on the ground. Now, the most complicated part of any hydroponics project, especially mine, where I've been mostly trying to gear it towards more of industrial growing system. For example, if we had a big greenhouse, this is probably the kind of system that I'd want to put in it. So I wanted to build a heavy-duty irrigation system, and one that I can probably scale later on. So what we have here is a power in cabinet. So we just have mains going in there and a distribution block that then connects to over here, which is the pump cabinet. It also has an accumulator in it, but the main duty of this cabinet is to house the pump and to keep it safe from the elements. So let's take a closer look at what's inside. If anyone else plans to do it this way, I would highly recommend getting some wing nuts, because undoing this every time by hand is kind of a pain in the rear end. And getting a cabinet that has a hinge on it, that's fairly expensive too. So the most cost-effective solution is probably to just buy a box of wing nuts, so you don't have to use a screwdriver to undo all of these screws. So let's take a closer look. So let's take a closer look inside the power and control cabinet. Over here we have a conduit coming in with mains 120 voltage, and we have a neutral lead in there that goes straight to the neutral terminal block, a ground lead that goes straight to a ground block inside the cabinet here, and then we have the hot lead which goes through this circuit breaker and ends up on this hot terminal block. To these two terminal blocks I have a Grassland timer relay connected, and basically what this relay does is you have, I think, 20 settings for on off, and you can say, for example, Monday through Sunday, turn on water at 8 in the morning, turn it off at 9 in the morning. Or you can, turn it off on some days and so on. But usually, so far, what I've been using is just every 2 hours, turn on the pump for 5 minutes and let that run. And at 6 in the morning and 12 in the morning, run it for about 15 minutes. And so far, that's been working out pretty well. If you have too much water in your tomatoes, they're going to burst. So you kind of have to play around with just how much water you're giving them to find a sweet spot, if there is any. Now, the Grassland timer relay is cheap and it works. In the future, if I want to improve on this system, I would replace the timer relay with a proper, hopefully a cheap PLC. Alright, now we can take a closer look at why the timer relay isn't the best option for watering these plants. Let's say you want to adjust how much water each plant is, or how much water all the plants are getting. So what you have to do is, now you have little tick marks along the upper right corner. Those are all the individual programs that I have set up. So for example, here we have the current time, 11:54. Along the left we have some tick marks which specify which day of the week it is, and then on the bottom the open circle means that currently the relay is off. When it turns on in about 6 minutes, there's going to be a circle inside the open circle. But let me show you how one would go about adjusting all the on-off cycles for these programs. So you go into menu, you press OK. Now you go through the current time and day of the week setting, and then now you're finally at the program setting. So I guess I was wrong before. I said I was watering every 2 hours, but I think the starting time here is at 5. So at 5 o'clock it turns on, and it's 7 days a week, and at 5:10 it turns off. And then at 8 o'clock it turns on again and runs for 10 more minutes. So I was wrong again. It runs for, I guess I have it running for 10 minutes every 2 hours. Yep, 10 minutes again, and then 12 minutes. Well, you get the point. But if you want to change something, you have to manually press these buttons for all the programs. Using a PLC, you could have a little potentiometer. Let me zoom out. But with a PLC, you could probably have the PLC set up right here and a little potentiometer here, and the PLC would be set up so that every 2 hours between, let's say, 5 in the morning or every 2 hours between 6 and 6, that is 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., it would turn on for a certain amount of time. So let's say the maximum amount of time that you might want it turned on may be, let's say, half an hour. And then you have a little potentiometer which gives out an analog signal. So you could set up the PLC so that it would take the maximum time and scale it by the potentiometer output value. So for example, if you have the potentiometer set at 50%, it would turn on for 15 minutes every 2 hours, or if you have it set to 25%, it would turn on for 7.5 minutes every 2 hours. And this way you could adjust how much water your plants are getting during different parts of the year. Now we can take a look inside the pump cabinet. Over here we have the conduit coming in from the power and control cabinet. We have power leads, so hot and neutral, going to these two terminal blocks, and we have a ground lead going to the enclosure. Over here and here on the bottom, I drilled 2 holes in the bottom of the cabinet and added some grommets for strain relief. And that's pretty much so that when the pump is running, it's going to be vibrating everything inside this cabinet. And if you don't protect the tubing against rubbing against the cut hole in this enclosure, eventually it will wear thin and likely burst or at least start leaking. So we have the inlet coming in here. It goes to this strainer filter over here. Then it enters the pump and goes to the accumulator tank. Now the purpose of the accumulator tank is to smooth out the pressure spikes in the system, and that basically has to do with how if you only have a piece of hose attached to this pump over here, which is more or less how a small hydroponic system looks like to a pump like this, it will take almost no time to pressurize the water inside that hose, and so the pump is going to quickly turn on and turn off. And then once again, it's not going to take long for all of that water, pressurized water, to come out of the emitters stuck in the tubing. So the pressure is going to rise and drop very quickly. So inside this accumulator tank, there is a rubber membrane in here, and it helps maintain pressure in the system and helps even out the spikes. This way the pump doesn't have to constantly cycle on and off. Other than that, I also have a cable down here. Right now it's more or less just jury rigged. This cable is for a UV sanitizer system. It's meant to be used in ponds, but here, in my system, if you look at all the plants, all of their containers, there's always algae in there, and I don't want that algae to quickly spread between different plants. More importantly, if there is any disease in the plants, I don't want the disease to come down the drain into the reservoir and infect all the other plants. So whenever the pump turns on, there is a UV system on the back of this panel here, and anytime the pump is running, the UV is running as well. So let me turn on the pump with the override to show you what it looks like when it runs. this is what it looks like at the containers. So you see the water dripping down. Got water over here. Got water over here. So pretty much got water dripping nicely everywhere on all of the plants. Over here we have the reservoir tank, which is actually just I'm not sure, I think it's like a 50-gallon utility bucket that you can buy at Home Depot. So over here we have the drain coming in from all of the plants. It comes in here and enters the reservoir tank. And all this is PVC conduit. I believe PVC conduit is a little bit better than just white PVC pipe for this application, simply because the white PVC pipe does not have any additives in it to prevent against UV damage. So the water comes in. Every once in a while you have to monitor the pH levels and the nutrient levels. And then over here you have the suction pipe that goes to the pump. Before it gets to the pump cabinet, it goes through this UV system on the back.